and welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's my honor today to have Mark Vroegop from College Park Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, here on the line to talk about his new book. Mark, how are you today?
I'm great, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
So if you're not familiar with Mark's work, he wrote a book last year called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament. That went on to win the 2020 ECPA Book of the Year award, and has, I think, just impacted so many people's lives. And now Mark has kind of taken that concept of lament and applied it to the issue of racial reconciliation. And those that listen to the podcast on a regular basis know that we have been talking about this a lot recently. Why? Because, and I think this is probably on the listener's heart as well, that after the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the protests, and then the unrest that's followed, it's almost like, where do we go from here? Where, as a society, we can pass 1,000 laws, but we still aren't fixing this issue. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk about this issue is it's one of the areas where I think in our secular society, secular ideas have shown themselves to be bankrupt. And it's an incredible opportunity for the church to show the power and the beauty of the gospel. And it's just an incredible opportunity for us. Mark has written a book that I think gives us a great first step. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to him about this idea of lament and how it opens a door to racial reconciliation. So Mark, would you jump in, give us a little bit of information about your past and your experience, especially in this issue?
Yeah, so I'm the pastor of College Park Church in Indianapolis. Been here now 11 plus years. Before that, I pastored in Western Michigan. And when I came to College Park, had a heart for racial reconciliation, but not a understanding of how to be able to engage in this conversation. So my heart was there because of some personal experiences, and also just some stuff the Lord had done in my own life. And over the course of time, I was doing some writing on the subject of lament because of a personal loss journey that my wife and I had been on beginning in 2004. And I began to see that there were parallels between the writing of lament and thinking about grief and how it applied specifically to racial reconciliation. And in God's providence, we also had some Black brothers and sisters in our church who started engaging with our pastoral staff, just saying, hey, how do we navigate this conversation together? And they started building relationships. That resulted in a conversation with our elders. And so actually this whole thing, my heart was ready for it, but other people have come along in the journey to help me think about how do we do this in the context of the church. And so that led to a bunch of different things that we've tried, from forums where we're trying to have honest conversations, conferences on this particular subject, civil rights vision trips, a meeting place once a month for people to have a venue to have these conversations, and just kind of a holistic picture of taking one of our values as a church, which is biblical unity and diversity, and asking ourselves, so how does that relate to racial reconciliation? And we are not a model by any stretch of the imagination. We just have tried to be in the conversation a little bit more over the last 5 years. And because of our proximity, kind of right between the suburbs and the city, the Lord's allowed us to have some opportunity to kind of enter into this conversation. And I've been really helped by it. It's also really challenging. And yet I think, as you said earlier, it's something the church should do. And so I'm really thankful for that.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in your book, and by the way, I didn't mention the actual title, Weep With Me, How Lament Opens the Door for Racial Reconciliation. That's out on July 14th, 2020 from Crossway, wherever books are sold. And I had the privilege of reviewing an advanced copy, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I hope you go out and pick up a copy, which has been extremely helpful. And so you kind of open the book with a personal journey. And those who listen to the podcast know that we had on Adrian Burden, a friend of mine who's a Black Christian and evangelist, who just shared some of his stories over the last 10 years of bias in the church, and just left me kind of for the first time just brokenhearted about this issue. And it sounds like you had a similar experience when you were working for a Christian college. Would you share that story?
Yeah, and I think, Josh, you just illustrated one of the key things that makes a difference, which is not just to approach this subject from a theoretical position, which it is theory, or merely spiritual or theological, all those things are true, or even political, but to actually think through, how does this issue relate to me personally, and what's my personal level of engagement? And so my own journey began years ago. When I was in college, I was an admissions counselor, and my responsibility was to have a particular territory. That territory included the urban center of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so myself, along with our diversity director, joined me in a conversation with a leading Black pastor in the community. I was trying to figure out, how do we get more of his students to our Christian college that had very little people of color on campus. And he basically identified, and I talk about this in the book, that there were just a lot of challenges, hurdles, barriers to his kids even considering applying. And he kind of ran through a list of those things. And, I'd heard that argument before. And when he said it, I pushed back immediately, kind of arrogantly, naively for sure. But my grandfather and dad came from the Netherlands in the 1940s. Like, they came to the United States with nothing. They moved to Western Michigan, and my family has lived the American dream. And so we're like that story of people who opportunities were all in front of us. And that Dutch narrative of, if you work hard, stay married, live frugally, like you can get ahead. And that's our story. So I shared that. I pushed back with that pastor, and I just said, what do you mean hurdles? My grandfather came here with nothing, and kind of that common narrative. And he then looked at me and he asked me a question. And he just said, Mark, do you think that your grandfather coming here in the 1940s and my grandfather in the 1940s would have been able to get the same job in Kalamazoo, Michigan? And I had never had that thought before. Wow. And I also immediately knew the answer, because I knew the city, I knew the jokes, I knew, even the kind of this mantra in Western Michigan, which is, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. And I just said to him, no, sir, he wouldn't have gotten the same job. And then he said, think how much difference that's made in your life. That's what I'm talking about. And when he said that, suddenly it was just like, I saw something and I felt something that I had never felt or seen before, and it broke me. I literally in the office started weeping. And I wasn't weeping over white guilt. I was weeping over my arrogance, that I had just constructed this narrative that was 100% true, but wasn't contextualized and considered in someone else's experience. And so I assumed what was true for me is true for everybody, and then applied that and used that to defend my position. And the Lord just broke me over that. And I was with our diversity director. She's an African-American woman. And she said to the pastor, what's going on here? And he said to her, our brother has just seen something he's never seen before. And he was right. So I left a changed person. I didn't know what to do with it. The implications of it were stunning and sweeping. And that just kind of opened the door for me to begin thinking about these things and kind of stumbling along. And depending upon my context and the people that were in my life or where I was living, I had different opportunities to explore this. And Indianapolis has been the primary place where I've really had an opportunity to dig into this issue. So my heart was in the right place, my competency way behind incompetency. And so it's been a great but painful journey to explore this more deeply.
And I get the sense that that's where a lot of white pastors are, especially after recent events. And maybe they're kind of waking up to this issue for the first time. And so I love that you've been able to take that realization and then implement it in a very well-respected, large, what we call a mega church in suburban Indianapolis. And so would you tell the story a bit about how you've implemented this at College Park, kind of starting with the leadership, and you took a journey to an important landmark there in Indianapolis, and then a civil rights vision trip. I love that idea. And then you have an ongoing conversation about this at the church. So would you kind of step through how those started and then what that looks like now?
Yeah. And, again, I just want to be really clear that this journey that the Lord has taken us on has involved lots of people. And so, I'm doing this interview with you, but we probably need about 30 people in the room to really tell the full story. So I want to represent them well, even in this interview, because this kind of conversation, and this is really key, doesn't happen apart from a community. Like, you need other people, particularly other minorities in your world, to help you understand how to be able to navigate through this. And so without some guys who frankly were a bit like missionaries in our church, I wouldn't have written this book. Like, it's dedicated to one of the couples, Keith and Yolanda White, who have been just really helpful and patient, and we've shed tears over these things. It's been a hard journey. So I don't want to create any illusions that our church is some sort of this utopia of racial reconciliation. It's messy, it's challenging. I just got off the phone with a conversation about a church member who's not happy about, some things. And I mean, it is a challenge. And it's sort of like where you see brokenness in the world, you see it really clearly as it relates to this conversation. And so, so we've done some things like we created some venues or some spaces for conversations to happen. So, in some cases, those just happened organically with a couple Black brothers starting to meet with one of our pastors at the McDonald's just to say, hey, let's do life together, have a conversation, let's build relationships so we can have the trust to talk about some hard things. That then led to a presentation to our elders about, here's some ways to think about diversity at our church. It led to some intentional efforts to be sure that our predominantly white church was aware and sensitive to how hard it can be sometimes to transition into a white suburban church, and recognizing what some of those barriers are and what can we do to be hospitable. And then it also led to an intentional effort with diversity with our elders, with our staff, with our pastors. If you were to go on our website and see the level of diversity, I'm disappointed with where we are. We got a long way to go yet. It's better than what it was 5 years ago, a lot better, but that doesn't justify any type of passivity at this point in time. I did a sermon series on it called One People. We hosted a theology conference for a weekend to delve into this subject. And then, one of the most impactful things that we've done is the Civil Rights Vision Trip. And the idea came out of visiting the Martin Luther King Jr. Park at 17th and Broadway, the Landmark for Peace Memorial, with our staff on Martin Luther King Day. I think pilgrimages and getting people in the space where they can experience something, not just intellectually, but more emotively and more personally, is really important in this, because I think the barriers that exist in the church aren't just intellectual. They're actually experiential and relational. And so what we did is we went there, we prayed together, and on the way back, one of our church members, Yolanda, said, wouldn't it be great if we could do this, but do this in the South? And I was like, that's a great idea. And so, we were just crazy enough to say, why not? And so we do this all the time with mission trips, right? We take people overseas, they see, what's going on and trying to reach unreached people groups. And I also know that it creates a bond with those people. Like, you come back from a mission trip, you're tight with those folks. So we tried this with a Civil Rights Vision Trip 2 years ago. We took 50 leaders. We went to Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, Memphis, went to Clarksdale, the location of Emmett Till's abduction. And we just basically go on site, do some learning, have dinner together, learn, laugh. We find ways to lament together. And it's a game changer. It helps you to taste and see of the experience of our Black brothers and sisters. And it's a transformative event. So you put all of that together, trying to create a venue for multiple layers of conversations so that people, depending on where they are in the continuum, can engage in a way that fits with their need in the moment. So there's some people who a Civil Rights Vision Trip would be a bad idea. Like, that's not a good idea. It's sort of like, there's some vision trips on the foreign mission field that are easier to do than others, right? So you want to start with where you are in the journey and your learning, competency. And so we've just tried to find different entry points for some people to engage. And there are some people in our church who they're just not really interested in this conversation. And we want to be a big enough church to say, we love you. We're going to still have it. We'd love to have you join us, but we're glad that you're still part of our church. And so it's not as though everyone looks at this issue like, oh, this is really important and we need to talk about it. We have Christians who love one another enough and say, I don't think this should be a priority right now. That's not where I'm at. It's not where our leadership is at, but that happens. So just it's important to realize this conversation is challenging at multiple levels, for sure.
You mentioned a particular memorial that I was not aware of. As you mentioned a couple times in the book, I've been embarrassed by the things that I don't know. I consider myself a student of history, but many things I did not know. One of them, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and I have a Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson,
Yeah, nice.
now in a movie format, but it's basically, I mean, it's termed a lynching memorial. Would you describe that just a little bit? I Googled it last night, and just be prepared. It's heart-wrenching. But would you describe just a little bit about that? And I believe there were maybe some kind of realizations even among those that went on the trip at that memorial.
Yeah, it's one of the most important places that I've ever visited, and I've actually been on the ground at Auschwitz and Birkenau, and
Wow.
I think this is comparable in terms of impact, maybe even more significantly, and here's why. In order to understand the history of the United States, in order to understand the Great Migration, where 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North, in order to understand the fear of our Black brothers and sisters as it relates to the justice system and not being treated fairly, you have to understand, and I would add, in order to understand the deep scar and stain of white supremacy in the United States, you have to understand lynching. Otherwise, you're going to miss the critical piece in the conversation. And the National Memorial for Peace and Justice is designed to help us realize that lynching was domestic terrorism on Black people. Mm. And it was used to keep them in subjugation as a form of terrorism. And yet many of us don't understand what that did and how it was used. And so the memorial is a series of metal boxes that are organized by counties in the United States, and it records the names and the dates of every person that was lynched in the United States. And it is a sobering memorial that you just don't even realize how important or what a big deal this category of grief really is. And so some of the people went on the trip, like they're standing in front of a box and they're realizing this is my county that I grew up in. Wow. And I didn't have any idea this was happening. And here's a story. I don't think I talk about this in the book, but one of the things, the moments that I really, it's really important in, as it relates to lynching, in a museum the one that we go to prior to the lynching memorial, there's a picture that summarizes the horror of lynching in this particular museum. It's a famous one. You can look it up. It's one where you see a Black man who's hanging. People are all in their Sunday best, and it's got a picture of a guy kind of pointing up at the dead body. It's a horrific, the kids are there. I mean, it's just awful. And I asked our group, where do you think this picture was taken? And they're like, oh man, Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually Marion, Indiana.
Oh my word.
One of the most famous and one of the most recent lynchings that's known historically, you could look it up, was in Marion, Indiana. And it's just a shocking reality of the people on our trip to suddenly realize, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't a Southern problem. Like this actually was an issue in Indianapolis or in the Indiana area. And so just to realize how what lynching meant, and once you understand that, you're able then to see events, even like George Floyd, through a different lens, because you're not looking at it the same way that our Black brothers and sisters are when you understand the history of lynching. So that's that, and to be in that space, you just to describe it, they've actually designed it so well, because when you go through the memorial, you actually walk down a slanted ramp, and as you walk down, the memorial markers get higher and higher in front of you, and so it's like you're walking underneath a lynching. So it's designed to be really powerful. And then in the center of the memorial is what looks like a city square or a city center, like a park that you would have in front of a city council building, for instance. And they have that intentionally because most lynchings happened in a public venue. And so that's why we don't understand. We're not as sensitive to this issue as what we need to be. it does something traumatic for our Black brothers and sisters that we need to fully understand.
Well, that's powerful. I'm going to look up the picture, and we'll link to the website for this memorial as well as for the book and College Park. I know you have quite a few resources highlighted right now on the church website.
We do.
So there's so many things we could talk about with the history and everything else, but you offer a very particular prescription for the church. And I'll tell you why it seems so powerful to me, because over the last couple of weeks, I've received kind of on one side, and I'm going to try to summarize. So please, anyone that's listening, understand I'm trying to summarize this really quickly.
Yeah.
And I try to catch the nuance of all of the arguments, but from many white Christians, I'm not a racist. Why should I confess or ask for or repent of something that I wasn't a part of? What is this thing called white privilege or systemic racism? And then what I'm hearing from Black Christians is you're not listening. You're not thinking about the history. You're not taking the time to be empathetic. And it's almost like there's an impasse there of even like good Bible believing, faithful Christians. And I love that the idea of lament gives us a way forward, I think, to move past those common talking points. And it's extremely biblical. So would you give us just kind of the basics of lament? There's also kind of the 5 steps or a plan there that you've laid out.
Yeah.
So would you explain that?
Yeah, you just identified the reason why I wrote the book is because I feel like when it comes to the subject of racial reconciliation, oftentimes the conversation goes like this. We move away from one another.
Right.
And it's sort of like if you're in a cross-cultural experience and you don't speak the language, after a while, it just gets really exhausting. And so you try and find other ways to communicate and you miss one another. It's just not helpful. And so lament doesn't solve all the problems, not even close. It's not a silver bullet. It's not like you start lamenting, all these problems go away. That's not what I'm arguing. What I am arguing, though, is it is the biblical language of people in pain, of communities that are suffering, and in particular, it's the language of injustice. So it just seems to me that if we could at least reclaim this lament language and put it in the space of racial reconciliation, maybe there's a chance that the church could help bend the poles from going away from one another to actually moving toward one another. And then we need to have other conversations, like all kinds of things. But at least it could bend us toward one another. Yeah. When you throw a question on the table with someone, like, are you a racist? Well, man, like, boom, lines are drawn. Or what about white privilege? Boom, why? And I mean, it's just, I find myself in this space having to define things all the time. And I think it's just one of the ways the enemy creates division by helping us not even know what words mean anymore. So lament, by definition, as I have worked it out, is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. So I'm talking to God, I'm in pain, but it's progressive in nature. It moves through a movement of I'm going to talk to God, lay out my complaint, going to ask boldly for his help, and I'm going to choose to trust. And so most laments follow that framework in one way or another. And as it relates to racial reconciliation, I think it can be the helpful language of Black brothers and sisters who need to vocalize their pain and find a language of how to talk to God and to us. It helps white brothers and sisters know how to empathize. And it also provides a way to memorialize the significance of this issue. We have memorials. Indianapolis has a ton of them, right? Probably, I think, more so than any city beside Washington, D.C. Why do we have memorials? Because we want to never forget, we want to remember, and we also want to reflect. And that's what lament does. It gives us a moment to go, wow, this is bad. But it also gives us hope to say, what do we do? So I have 5 steps, and this is just how I've worked it out. I got to start with, I love you as my brother and sister in Christ. Gospel gets underneath all identity markers, including ethnicity. Doesn't diminish them, but it gets underneath. I'm going to listen. I'm going to practice James chapter 1, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to get angry. I'm going to lament, meaning I hear you, I love you. So the first thing, I may not even understand your pain, but I'm going to sit with you, brother, and what pains you pains me, Romans 12:15. And the same thing that I would do with my wife. When she's grieving, like, she doesn't want me to fix it. She doesn't want me to study her. She wants me to sit there and hold her because I'm her husband, right? So love, listen, lament, then learn. I don't think you can learn really well in this category unless you've lamented and you're willing to listen and you love. I think people will, if they don't do those 3 things, they're learning so they can argue. They're not learning to try and bring reconciliation. And then finally, to leverage. Our Black brothers and sisters get really weary of white folks just praying about this and never doing anything. And I think we need to figure out how do we then take action to be able to live out the gospel in the context of a broken world. Not that replaces the gospel, but just says, hey, if Christian gospel witness is substantial, seems like it ought to affect how I live out being a neighbor and what I'm concerned about around me. So love, listen, lament, learn, leverage. That's the fivefold under the banner of what it means to use lament for racial reconciliation.
That's so helpful. And I just found one kind of practical issue that you mentioned, and Martin Luther King referred to these as Negro spirituals. I think we just refer to them as spirituals, but just so I think everyone knows that category. And many of the hymns that we have are kind of traced back to the spiritual. But will you talk about how the spiritual kind of gives us a direction and is a great example of this?
Yeah, in the book, I mentioned that I think the spirituals are a great starting point to listen to what lament sounds like. It's a great place to learn as we listen to lament. It started my kind of journey in the spirituals, and I did a lot of research, but you could go a lot further, so I'm not an expert in this in any way. But it started with an interviewer about my first book, and she said, "Why do you think the church doesn't understand lament?" And I said, if I could, I'd like to reframe your question. And that is, why does the white church not understand lament? Because in my spaces, it felt like the churches that I've known don't understand lament. But if you look for lament, you're going to find it in the context of African-American history. In fact, spirituals show it to us really clearly. You even think of things like blues and jazz and where those things have their source and why Memphis, as the cotton hub of the South and et cetera, et cetera. So like there's so many connections related to a tone or a sound that's trying to reflect the brokenness of the world around us. And spirituals in particular take that kind of somber tone and they apply a spiritual framework to that, where African-American folks were just trying to do something with their pain. So spirituals, I think, are instructive so that we can look at them and read them and enter in. Music allows us to even feel things that we wouldn't feel by just reading. And so in my book, I talk about, what it's like to be a motherless child in families that are separated, and what that did to the family and what it would be like. Like, it's just, what do you say when you're a mom and you have all of your kids taken away and sold? And spirituals reflect on that. And so they help us not just to know that happened and not just to know where it happened, but also to know how that would feel. And a spiritual helps us you'll never know what it feels like entirely, but the spirituals help us to get a little closer.
That's really helpful. And one of the things that you mentioned, and we'll take the empathy test here in just a second. It seems to me one of the key parts of this argument is, especially those that are, more conservative white Christians, their kind of knee-jerk reaction to anything that has to do with race is often, well, but that's just a media talking point. Well, and so they jump to the kind of the facts of the situation and trying to explain it away rather than trying to sit back and empathize. So would you talk about empathy and even kind of explain that empathy test that you give in the book?
Yeah. So let's say that you have a friend. Let me take it to non-racial reconciliation. Let's say that you have a friend who was a victim of sexual assault. Let's just say that. And that's part of his or her past. And one night you get a phone call from them and they just say, I am scared to death and just panic because of what just happened. And they describe something that was eerily similar to all the dynamics that led to their sexual assault. In that moment, what do you say? Do you start arguing with them about the statistics of sexual assault? Do you tell them, do you encourage them by saying, well, most people aren't sexually assaulted. I'm sure, do you start questioning their experience? What do you do when someone's experienced trauma? And the answer, of course, is, of course you don't do that. You lean in with empathy. You try to seek first to understand. You try and be there, that the facts of the situation may matter. But what really matters is you've got a brother or a sister who's deeply grieving. And my question is just, why do we have such a difficulty applying the same thing to racial trauma as it relates to issues in our culture and our community? Because when our Black brothers and sisters see George Floyd and his life being snuffed out and him being killed, yet that's not just a video to them. Like, they think back on their traumatic experience with the justice system or law enforcement. They think about people that have been unfairly treated. And yeah, there's great police officers, 100%. We need a lot more of them. I'm not saying all cops are bad, but I am saying that my Black brothers have a lot more stories of their encounters with law enforcement that don't sound anything like mine. And so the question at that moment is whether or not we lean in with empathy or we lean back. Give you an illustration. A woman in our church shared with somebody, this isn't in the book, shared with somebody that she was at a gas station and there was a police officer waiting outside in the car. And after a church service, she told someone this story. And she said, I came out of the grocery store and I was just scared, or the gas station, just scared to death that I might be killed by that police officer. And this person I was talking with actually said to this church member, you wouldn't be killed. Give me a break. And they looked at them and they were deeply hurt. And I had to tell that other church member, you need to realize that she's not talking about the facts. She's talking about fear. Now, are facts something that we need to talk about? For sure. But the question we have to ask ourselves first, am I coming at this simply from an impersonal policy perspective versus realizing that my sister in Christ, when she walked out of that gas station, was afraid? And why is she afraid? And do I care about that? So what happens is we end up caring more about the stats or the policies or the questions about statistics than we actually do about the substance of her fear. And that gets really personalized for our Black brothers and sisters. And that's one of the reasons the conversation goes like this. Because if you've had trauma in your life and you share about your trauma and people want to argue with you about your trauma, you just don't want to talk about your trauma anymore. And that's part of the challenge that's in the context of the church.
This is so powerful. And one of the reasons why I started this podcast, it was to study, what does a gospel-centered citizenship look like in post-Christian America? How is that different from just our traditional way of doing this? And as a gospel-centered citizen, you're not, like you said, just going to look at, okay, I can quote all the stats in the book at you, but you look at the person as someone made in the image of God and someone that you're supposed to love and help. And that can't be divorced from just simple policy prescriptions. And so that's so powerful. So as we come to kind of last piece of our interview here, there's a powerful section in your book about why is the church, especially the white church, not engaging? And I had the privilege of hearing you pray a powerful lament for the unborn at the Walk for Life in Indianapolis this January. And you make a really powerful comparison in between the life issue and then the race issue. So would you help Christians think through that well?
Yeah, most Christians in my space are clearly anti-abortion. And by that, they know abortion is wrong and they would want for abortions not to happen. But they would also think, we need to do something about this. So it's not just enough to be a person who thinks abortion is wrong or somebody who doesn't commit abortion. Our standard is we need to be anti-abortion. And, in my reading and conversations with others in this space, it came to my attention that Christians don't think of racism in the same way. For many of us, we think it's enough not to be racist, and we shouldn't be racist. For many of us think it's enough to be against racism. Like if someone was racist, I would say you shouldn't talk like that. But there's also this position where we need to be actually anti-racist and to ask ourselves, where might there be still lingering indications of partiality, prejudice, or in some cases even a superiority complex that some have? Is it the same as it was back in the 1930s and 40s? Probably not. But do those things still remain with us in some way? I think it would be naive to think that all went away with the Civil Rights Act. I think that sin is so powerful, it slithers its way into the halls of Congress. It slithers its way into homeowners association bylaws. I think it slithers its way into how we interact with one another. And I think as a result, we need to be constantly asking ourselves, how can I be a part of bringing change? And I think that's actually where the church comes in. I think the church's story is we have a King Jesus who brings people together, Jew, Gentile, slave, free. This is from Colossians chapter 3, but Christ is all and in all. And the beautiful story of the gospel in the New Testament church is a people who love Jesus and they love one another beyond ethnic lines, so much so that in the city of Antioch, the culture didn't know what to call them. You're not Jew, you're not Gentile. What are these people? They had to create a new name, and the new name was Christian. So I think ethnic reconciliation is a vital part of the church's story. It's not the same as the gospel, but it's a vital application of the gospel. And I think it presents an opportunity for the church to live out the beauty of what the gospel can do.
Into that, you mentioned the story of Bonhoeffer, and I've read his story before, but had not connected the pieces there. And so everybody celebrates him standing up to Hitler, but you give a part of his story that informed his courage when he went back to Germany. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, it comes out of a book called Black Jesus, captivating title in that respect. And it just talks about how Bonhoeffer learned his understanding of resistance and an ethical framework to see the plight of the Jews by his time in Harlem, particularly at a church called Abyssinian Baptist Church. And by immersing himself into that culture and even listening to the spirituals, Bonhoeffer developed an ethic of, you know what, this kind of dynamic between peoples isn't right. And so he goes to Germany, sees the exact same thing happening, and he becomes very passionate to stop it. And at times would even take students away on retreats. They'd listen to the spirituals collection that he had and talk about these issues. And so, you know, Bonhoeffer, a number of his books are so influential, and we tout him as a model of resistance at some level. We just need to recognize that he learned that from Black brothers and sisters in Harlem. I mean, that's just amazing. And yet it's incredible and at times outrageous that I didn't know that until reading this book. And I just think it's part of the story that needs to be told about the value of the Black church's contribution to where we are today.
And there's so much here, and I'm glad that you brought up that sentence. I highlighted that sin slithers into essentially every human institution. And for those that are jumping into this for the first time, I noticed you did a Facebook Live the other day, kind of giving a headline view of some top works. So would you mention somebody that's getting into this for the first time? What books might you recommend? Of course, yours as well. Yeah. But what other books might you recommend that they read first?
Well, that's hard because I want to qualify the word recommend, right? Because I jokingly say there's only now 3 books that I believe everything in them: the Bible, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and Weep With Me. So those are I want to be really careful. And additionally, if I give someone the wrong advice, it'd be like going to a Mexican restaurant and saying, hey, try this salsa, and it's like ghost pepper. And it's just like, whoa, sure. It's really, really challenging. So I guess here's what I would advise. I think people need, if they go to the back of my book, see the bibliography. I reviewed 12 books on my that Facebook Live. Maybe you want to link to that. Yep. It really depends upon the issue that they want to address. So I'm not trying to evade your question, but I don't want to give a recommendation when there's, the level of reading on this, could be all over the map.
Sure. I certainly understand that. I did see that there's a great bibliography, and you do give the caveat. Look, these are instructive. They're not inspired. So just take them at that level. Yeah.
And in some cases too, just so we know, that you have to read non-Christian authors to understand where we are today. And part of the reason is that the history of the church in the United States on this subject has been woefully neglectful. And as a result, other people have led the conversation. And so part of what I want to do is get Christians back into the space to say, look, we should have been leading in this and shaping the narrative, but we historically haven't. And I think that's, again, instead of going like this, I'd like to see us go like that. But it's complicated, it's messy. And, even in the last number of weeks, I see more clearly why there's a tendency to go, yeah, I'm out. This is, because it's tough. It's just really hard.
Well, and so I'm glad you've written this book. I have just two last questions for you. And what you stated is the vision for the Daniel Initiative in the state of Indiana, the Good Citizen Project across the country, and that is having the church kind of serve its way back to the center of the city. I believe the gospel is the answer for our deepest woes. It's just the question of, well, how do you exactly do that, especially now? So as we finish up, you've mentioned lament. And I think even corporately, pastors are going to ask, if I lead my congregation in lament, is it kind of virtue signaling? Am I asking for forgiveness for something that we haven't participated in? Now, there are a lot of churches that even have history of segregation and such, and so they could certainly repent of that. But you mentioned Daniel and Nehemiah. So you could jump into that issue, and then any other practical steps that you think church leaders, Christians, churches corporately could be taking.
Yeah, let's start with the practical steps if we could,
Sure.
and then I'll get to the other. So I think first and foremost, it really comes down to relationship and who do you know that you're doing life with who's not your diversity consultant. Like you're going to have your kids over, you're going to do stuff that you would do with all your other friends with folks who don't look like you and whose experience is different than yours. And that makes a difference because when I saw the George Floyd video, I didn't think, oh no, here's another video. I thought about David and Jeff and Kenya and Essence. I thought about Candace. I thought about Keith and Yolanda White. And I could Reggie. And I thought about people that I love. And I'm like, oh. And so if you study this without that context, that's a really, really bad idea. So I think churches need to find a way practically to build relationships. Maybe you're in a community that isn't as diverse, so you could partner with another church and start just having meals together or pastors connecting. I remember having a lunch with a well-known Black pastor in the city, and he said to me, "So why are we meeting today? What do you need?" And I said, "Brother, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to spend some time with you." And he actually sat back and he said, "Really?"
Wow.
And I said, "Yeah, like I just want to know you and I want to learn from you." And he was apparently that's not what he expected. And I think that's just really sad. And then creating opportunities for people to dialogue and to maybe read some books together, to be able to start having a conversation on the ground practically. And then just finding ways to encounter experiences that are outside of your historical narrative would be really important. So that's, again, it kind of relates, Josh, to where somebody is on the paradigm or on the linear perspective in this conversation. As to the public, can't repent for stuff that I didn't do. That's true-ish. It's true at one level, but we also frequently express remorse, and this is the distinction that I make in the book. It's not just a play on words, but I'm trying to get to the fact that when we have Sanctity of Life Sunday, and we're grieving over the presence of abortion in the world, we're not confessing that we've committed abortion. I'm not confessing that I voted for the people who put the judges in place that ruled in Roe v. Wade. I'm not confessing any of that, but I am confessing I live in a world that still tolerates abortion, and my participation in that world makes me complicit in some way. And so the not the same as if I'm an abortion doctor or if I'm an abortion provider or if I'm a legislator. We all have different levels of responsibility in that respect. But I do think we could express remorse and say what happened in the past is not us anymore. We don't want that to be us. We recognize that happened. We don't deny that that's there. In fact, we want to remember so that we can be a different people. And I just find, unfortunately, that some people, as it relates to race, they just don't want to remember. And they think that remembering is somehow, it makes it worse. And I would just say, we don't do that with other things that are important. And so I think we ought to not do that when it comes to this topic.
That's excellent. And I highlighted another statement you made on page 89 of the book. Racial reconciliation is possible only in the context of relationship.
Yep.
And that was just, we could talk about lots of different policy issues, but look, we've been working on the legal side of this for a while. Do we still have a way to go? Sure. But if the events of the last couple of weeks are any indicator, the relational side, the side that the church can actually help with, is the bigger issue. And so let's dive in and build those relationships. It's excellent. So Mark, I often ask this question. I borrowed this question from podcaster Tim Ferriss, but if you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the gospel preaching church, what would you put on it?
Yeah, billboards are great, aren't they? You have to use very few words. So here's what it would be. Gospel unity creates racial harmony.
Wow.
Gospel unity creates racial harmony. I think that if there isn't racial harmony in the church, we're missing it because racial reconciliation is not something that has to be achieved. It's already done. And the fact that it isn't here says something. So gospel unity creates racial harmony. And I think Lament helps us to take some steps toward getting toward that very helpful and biblical goal.
That's excellent. So much to chew on here. And thank you so much for taking the time to write this book, Weep With Me, How Lament Opens the Doors for Racial Reconciliation. We'll put a link in the show notes to the Crossway website where you can find that coming out July 14th, 2020. Mark, thank you for your leadership in this issue, and I look forward to hearing your continued efforts to establish that type of gospel unity in College Park and beyond.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate your interest.